The hum sat in the back of his throat like a second heartbeat, low and constant, the way a candle flame holds to its wick even when the wind tries to kill it. Elara pressed the damp rag against the sticky residue on the bar counter, her fingers raw from lye soap, and listened to the boy humming 3 tables away. He was maybe 12, rail-thin, with a collar of tarnished bronze circling his neck that marked him as bonded property. The tune he carried was strange. Not a tavern song, not a lullaby. Something older, with intervals that climbed in a way that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She had heard that melody before, 10 years ago, in a life that belonged to someone else. The rag stopped moving. Elara's knuckles went white against the wood. The tavern called the Soot and Antler sat at the crossroads of 3 territories, neutral ground, where wolves from warring packs could drink without gutting each other. And she had scrubbed its floors and polished its brass taps for 6 of those 10 years. Before that, she had belonged to a textile mill in the Grey March lowlands, carding wool until her fingertips split and bled and healed and split again. Before that, she had belonged to a farming settlement on the eastern ridge. And before all of it, before the auction block, before the brand on her left shoulder blade, she had belonged to a pack that no longer existed. The boy hummed, and the melody curled through the smoke and grease and the sour tang of spilled mead, and it found her. She knew this song the way she knew her own bones, the battle hymn of the Ashen Moor, her pack, her dead, destroyed, salted earth pack. Elara set the rag down carefully and moved toward the boy's table, weaving between the bodies of half-drunk traders and off-duty border guards. The floor was tacky under her thin-soled shoes. Someone had vomited near the hearth, and she had not gotten to it yet. The fire crackled with green-tinged flame, because Bertram, the tavern owner, bought the cheapest firewood available, and the cheapest firewood was always damp pine that popped and spat. She crouched beside the boy's chair. He stopped humming and looked at her with eyes the color of wet slate. "Where did you learn that song?" she asked. His face went careful, guarded, the face of a child who had learned early that questions from adults usually preceded pain. "Don't remember," he said. "Yes, you do." He studied her. She watched him take in her appearance, the way everyone did, with a quick catalogue of damage. The scar that ran from her left temple to the hinge of her jaw, courtesy of a mill overseer's belt buckle. The thinness of her wrists, the faded brand visible at the collar of her shirt when it shifted. The dull brown of her hair, cropped short because long hair was a hazard around industrial looms. "A woman taught me," he said finally. "In the camp at Brackensfield. She was old. She hummed it all the time. Said it was the only thing she still owned that nobody could take." Elara's throat tightened. "What was her name?" "Maren. She died last winter." "Maren." Elara closed her eyes. Maren had been the Ashenmore Pack's herbalist, a woman with hands that smelled of crushed lavender and calendula, who had set Elara's broken wrist when she was 7 and told her, "Bones remember, they heal stronger at the break." Maren, who had been 60 when the Ashenmore fell, which meant she had survived another decade as a bonded labourer before the cold or the work or the grief finally took her. "I know that song," Elara told the boy. "I used to sing it." He tilted his head. Something flickered behind his careful expression. Recognition, maybe. Or hope, which was worse, because hope in a bonded child was a cruelty all its own. "Elara." Bertram's voice cut across the room like a dull blade through gristle. "That counter isn't going to wipe itself, and table 9 needs clearing." She stood, touched the boy's shoulder once, briefly, feeling the sharp ridge of bone beneath the fabric. He flinched, then didn't. She went back to work. That was the shape of her life. Small moments of connection that the machinery of servitude immediately ground away. She had been sold at 8 years old, the night the Ashenmore pack burned. She remembered the heat, the screaming, the way her mother had pushed her under the floorboards and told her to breathe through the cracks in the wood and not to come out no matter what she heard. She had breathed through those cracks for hours, inhaling smoke and the copper scent of blood, until rough hands pulled her out and someone said, "Another Omega pup. She'll fetch maybe 40 silvers." She had fetched 42. That was 18 years ago. She was 26 now, and she had been property for most of her life. And she had learned to make herself small and useful and invisible. Omegas were the lowest caste in the pack hierarchy, valued for labor and obedience and nothing else. An Omega without a pack was less than nothing. An Omega who had been sold, branded and traded between owners like livestock was a footnote in someone else's ledger. But she still hummed the hymn. She hummed it while scrubbing pots in the back kitchen, where the steam from the massive iron cauldrons turned the air into something you could almost chew. She hummed it while hauling water from the well in the courtyard, the bucket's rope leaving raw welts across her palms. She hummed it while setting out fresh rushes on the tavern floor before dawn, when the only light was the grey smear of pre-sunrise leaking through oilskin windows. The melody was hers, the one thing the old woman Maren had been right about. Nobody could take a song from your throat unless they cut the throat itself. She hummed it to the travellers who passed through, to the bone-weary peddlers and the wounded soldiers, and the other bonded workers she sometimes met at the well or the market. She hummed it like a prayer, or a signal fire, or a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean she would never see. She did not know who she was humming it for. She only knew she could not stop. Tonight, the tavern was fuller than usual. Word had filtered through the border towns all week, carried by merchants and spies, and the inevitable gossip that moved faster than any messenger hawk. The Alpha King was traveling. Kyle Draven, ruler of the Iron Moor Dominion, the largest and most feared territory on the continent, was moving through the border regions with a contingent of his royal guard. The reasons varied depending on who you asked. Some said he was inspecting the frontier defenses. Some said he was hunting a rogue pack that had been raiding supply lines. Some said he was looking for something, though no one could agree on what. Elara did not care about the Alpha King. She did not care about kings or alphas, or politics or wars. These were things that happened above her, around her, to her, but never because of her. She was furniture. She was a rag and a pair of hands. She cleared table 9. Lamb bones and bread crusts and a puddle of gravy that had gone cold and gelatinous. The men who had been sitting there were border guards from the Silver Pine pack, and they had left no tip and a crude drawing scratched into the wood with a knife point. She wiped it away with her rag and felt nothing about it. The boy with the bronze collar was still sitting at his table. His owner, a textile merchant named Doric, was at the bar arguing about the price of flax thread. The boy had a cup of water in front of him, and nothing else. Elara detoured to the kitchen, wrapped 2 pieces of bread and a chunk of hard cheese in a cloth, and brought it to him on her way past. She set it on the table without a word. He looked at it, looked at her, said nothing, took the bread. These were the transactions of the invisible. Small, silent, unrecorded. She had been fed this way herself in the early years, A piece of bread slipped to her by another bonded worker. A cup of broth left where she would find it. The economy of people who had nothing but could still give. She was humming again. She did not always realize when she started. The hymn lived in her body like a reflex, like blinking, and it came out whenever her hands were busy and her mind drifted. The melody was in a minor key, but not a sorrowful one. It had the quality of a march, something built to be sung by people who were walking toward something difficult and choosing not to turn back. It had been the Ashen Moor Pack's anthem, sung at gatherings and hunt departures and naming ceremonies. Her father had sung it with a baritone that shook the walls. Her mother had harmonized, her alto threading through his voice like ivy through stone. They were both dead. Everyone was dead. And the song lived in the throat of a scarred Omega wiping tables in a tavern that smelled of tallow and wet dog and the vinegar Bertram used to cut his wine. The door opened, cold air pushed in, carrying the scent of pine resin and rain-soaked earth, and something else, something underneath, like iron heated until it glowed. The candles on the nearest tables guttered and leaned. The fire in the hearth shuddered. Every wolf in the room felt it. Elara saw it happen, saw the border guard stiffen, saw the merchant Doric stop mid-sentence, saw Bertram's hand freeze on the tap. Dominance, not the casual, territorial kind that every alpha carried like a second skin. This was something structural, tectonic, the kind of dominance that rearranged the air pressure in a room and made your inner wolf want to drop flat on its belly and show its throat. 3 men entered first. Royal Guard, obvious from the black leather armor tooled with the Iron Moor sigil, a jawbone wrapped in thorns. They scanned the room with the flat, professional gaze of people paid to identify threats. Then they stepped aside. The Alpha King walked in. He was taller than any man in the room by a full head, and broader across the shoulders by a margin that seemed almost architectural. His hair was black, not the dark brown that people called black, but genuinely black, the color of a deep lake at midnight. It was pulled back from his face, revealing features that were handsome in the way a cliff face was handsome, all hard planes and sharp angles, with a scar that curved from below his right ear to the corner of his jaw. His eyes were amber, not brown, not hazel. Amber, the exact color of tree sap that had trapped something ancient inside it. He wore no crown. He did not need one. The tavern went quiet, in the way a forest goes quiet when a predator enters. Not silence exactly, but a collective holding of breath, a reduction of movement to the absolute minimum required by biology. Bertram recovered first, because Bertram was a businessman, and the Alpha King's coin was as good as anyone's. Better. He came around the bar, wiping his hands on his apron, his professional smile bolted into place. Your Majesty, an honor. We have a private room upstairs if you'd prefer. Here is fine. The Alpha King's voice was low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. He moved to a table near the wall, a table Elara had just cleaned, and the guard arranged themselves around him in a loose perimeter. Elara stood near the kitchen doorway, with a stack of dirty plates in her hands, and watched. She should move. She should take these plates to the kitchen and come back and take the king's order like any other customer. That was her job. That was what furniture did. It functioned. But her wolf, her small, quiet, perpetually suppressed wolf, the one that had never fully manifested, because Omegas were not built for power, and bonded Omegas were not built for anything at all. That wolf stirred. It lifted its head inside her chest like something waking from a long, drug-induced sleep, and it made a sound she had never heard it make before. Not a whimper, not a growl. Something between a keen and a cry of recognition, as if it had found a trail it had been searching for through years and years of featureless dark. No, she tightened her grip on the plates. No, she knew what this was. She had heard other wolves describe it. The pull, the tug behind the sternum, the sudden irrational certainty that the person across the room was the other half of a lock you did not know you carried. The mate bond, and it was impossible, because she was a bonded omega scrubbing tables in a border tavern, and he was the alpha king, and the universe did not work like the fairy tales that bonded children whispered to each other in the dark. She turned away. She took the plates to the kitchen. She set them in the wash basin. She put her hands flat on the scarred wooden counter and breathed through her mouth, because if she breathed through her nose, she would smell him, the iron and pine, and something else she could not name, like the air before a lightning strike, and her wolf would start making that sound again, and she would shatter. Elara! Bertram appeared in the kitchen doorway, face flushed. The king's table, now. Wine, bread, whatever he wants. And for the love of the moon, don't stare at him. She dried her hands. She poured wine into a flagon. She cut bread and arranged it on a board with butter and cold meat. She put it all on a tray. Her hands were shaking, and she gripped the tray harder until the tremor stayed in her muscles instead of the surface. She walked out. The room had resumed its careful, reduced hum of activity. People were drinking and talking, but quietly, and no one sat with their back to the king's table. Elara crossed the floor. She could feel the heat of his presence before she reached the table, an actual physical warmth that radiated from him like a banked furnace. Her wolf was clawing at her ribs. She kept her eyes down. She set the flagon on the table. She set the breadboard beside it. She was about to turn away when she realized she was humming. The hymn. It had crept out of her without permission, the way it always did, threading through her exhale in a line of melody so quiet that no human ear would catch it. But wolf ears were not human ears, and Alpha King ears were something else entirely. She felt it happen, felt the exact moment the sound reached him. The air between them changed, compressed, as if a door had slammed in a room she could not see. She stopped humming. She stopped breathing. She looked up. Cale Draven was staring at her. He had gone completely still. Not the stillness of a man who had heard something interesting. The stillness of a man who had been struck. His amber eyes were locked on her face with an intensity that felt like being held in a fist, not painfully, but totally, with no possibility of escape. His right hand, which had been reaching for the wine flagon, was frozen in mid-air. He breathed in. Slowly, deliberately. She saw his nostrils flare, saw his chest expand, saw the muscles in his jaw tighten as if he was clenching his teeth against something that threatened to pour out. "That song," he said. His voice was different now. Still low, still unhurried, but underneath it, a vibration, a subsonic rumble that she felt in her back teeth. His wolf. His wolf was right at the surface, pressing against the inside of his skin. "That song," he said again. "Where did you learn it?" She should lie. She should say she heard it from a traveler, that it was just a tune, that it meant nothing. She should deflect and retreat and make herself invisible the way she had practiced for 18 years. "It was mine before anything else was taken from me," she said. The words came out before she could stop them, and they came out steady, which surprised her. She was standing in front of the most powerful wolf on the continent, and her voice was not shaking. He leaned forward, just slightly, a shift of weight that brought him closer and intensified the scent pouring off him, iron and pine and that electric pre-storm charge, until she could taste it on the back of her tongue. "Who are you?" he asked. "Not what is your name. Who are you?" As if he could sense that the answer to the first question would not touch the truth of the second. "Nobody," she said. "I'm nobody." "You're lying." He said it without anger, almost with wonder. "I can hear your heartbeat. You're terrified." But you looked me in the eye. She realized he was right. She was looking directly into his eyes, those amber, ancient, impossible eyes. And she had not lowered her gaze. Every wolf instinct she possessed should have had her on the floor, belly up, throat bared. Instead, she was standing, looking at him, and something in her, something deeper than instinct, something that lived in the same place as the him, refused to look away. "Elara!" Bertram called from behind the bar, his voice carrying a sharp edge of warning. "Other tables!" She broke eye contact. It felt like pulling a hook from her own flesh, a physical wrench that left a throbbing absence. She turned. She walked away. She felt his gaze on her back like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades, warm and heavy, and impossible to ignore. She cleared tables. She wiped surfaces. She avoided the king's side of the room with the desperation of someone avoiding a cliff edge in darkness. But she could feel him. The bond, which she had never asked for and did not want, was a line of light strung between her ribs and his, and every step she took pulled it taut. "Who is she?" She heard him ask it, not because she was close, but because her hearing had sharpened in the last 5 minutes in a way it had never done before. Her senses, which had always been muted, dampened, the pale flicker of an Omega's diminished wolf, were suddenly vivid. She could smell the individual components of the fire. Pine sap, ash, the calcium tang of limestone mortar in the hearth. She could hear the heartbeat of the boy with the bronze collar, fast and rabbity, and scared. She could hear Bertram answer. "Bonded Omega. Bought her 6 years ago from a mill in Greymarch. Works hard, doesn't complain. That's all I know." A pause. Then the king's voice, and the subsonic rumble was louder now, almost audible to human ears. "Bought her." "Yes, sire, standard commercial bond, legal and registered." Another pause. Longer. Elara set down a stack of cups in the wash basin and gripped the edge. She heard one of the guards shift his weight. She heard the king's breathing, slow and controlled, the breathing of a man who was choosing very carefully not to destroy something. "Bring me her papers," the king said. Bertram hesitated. "Sire, with respect, she's just a—" "Her papers, now." Bertram brought the papers. Elara knew where he kept them, in a locked drawer behind the bar, along with the bonds of the 2 other owned workers. She had never read hers. She knew what they said. Sale price, transfer history, physical description, brand registry number. The paperwork that reduced a person to property. She heard the rustle of pages, then nothing. Then the sound of paper tearing. A clean, deliberate sound, repeated twice. She turned around. The Alpha King was holding 2 halves of a document. He placed them on the table, reached for the candle, and held the pieces to the flame. They caught instantly, edges curling to black, the ink vanishing into smoke. He watched them burn until the fire touched his fingers, and then he set the remains on the breadboard and let them die. The tavern was silent again, the deep, breathless silence. "She belongs to no one," the king said. He was not speaking to Bertram. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. But every wolf in the room heard it as a decree. If anyone has a claim on her, speak now, and I will settle it. No one spoke. Bertram opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the ashes of his 42 silver investment, and managed a strangled, "Yes, Your Majesty." Elara stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands at her sides, and felt something crack open in her chest, something she had cemented shut so long ago that she had forgotten it was there. Not hope, not relief, something more animal than either. Her wolf, her small, muted, invisible wolf, howled. She clamped her jaw and swallowed the sound, but it rang through her body like a struck bell. The king looked at her across the room. She looked at him. The bond between them burned like a filament of white fire, and neither of them moved. "Come here," he said. She did not move. "Please," he added, and the word sounded like it cost him something, like a coin paid from a purse he rarely opened. She moved. One step, then another, her thin shoes on the sticky floor, past the tables of stunned drinkers, past Bertram's rigid smile, past the royal guards who watched her with professional blankness. She stopped at the edge of his table, close enough now to see the individual threads of silver at his temples, close enough to see that the scar on his jaw was older than the others, a childhood wound, close enough to smell him fully, and the scent was overwhelming, hot iron and resinous pine, and underneath it, unmistakable, the electric sweetness that was the mate bond, announcing itself to every cell in her body. "You're him," he said. "Sing the second verse." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because I know the first verse. I have known it since I was 5 years old, when an emissary from a pack called Ashenmoor taught it to my father's court as a gesture of alliance. I was a boy. I learned the first verse. The emissary was killed before he could teach the rest." He paused. "I have been listening for the second verse for 25 years. Her legs felt weak. She locked her knees. "Ashenmoor is dead. The pack was destroyed." "I know. My father failed to protect them. It is one of the reasons I am not my father." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly. More like a controlled demolition of the hardness, deliberate, structural, creating space where there had been wall. "Sing it." She opened her mouth. The melody rose from the place where she had kept it safe for 18 years. The place below fear, below pain, below the accumulated scar tissue of a life lived as property. It rose, and it came out clear. The second verse of the Ashenmoor battle hymn was not about battle. It was about returning, coming back from the dark, finding the path through the forest when the markers had been torn down and the stars were hidden. It was about the voice that calls you home when home no longer exists. She sang it in the language of the old wolves, the words rough and guttural and beautiful, and her voice was not trained and it cracked on the high notes, and it did not matter. The melody filled the room. The candles steadied. The fire in the hearth stopped spitting and burned clean. The Alpha King listened with his eyes closed. His hands were flat on the table, and she could see them trembling. Not with anger, with something else. When she finished, the last note dissolving into the smoky air like a stone dropped into water, he opened his eyes. They were wet. He blinked it away, swallowed. When he spoke, his voice was entirely steady, which told her exactly how much effort it was costing him. "You will leave this place tonight," he said. "You will come to Ironmoor, not as property, not as a servant, as my guest." "I don't want to be anyone's guest," she said. "I want to be left alone." He studied her. "No, you don't. Your wolf is screaming at you right now, the same way mine is screaming at me. But you have been taught that wanting things is dangerous, so you call it wanting to be left alone. The accuracy of it landed like a slap. She flinched. Then she straightened, and the small, defiant motion made him lean back slightly, a nearly imperceptible yielding of space. She catalogued it. The Alpha King of Ironmore had just given ground to a scarred, branded Omega in a border tavern. "The boy," she said, "the one at table 4, with the bronze collar. He comes too." Kael looked toward where the boy sat. He assessed. She watched him do it, watched his gaze take in the collar. The thinness, the posture of a child accustomed to being struck. "Done," he said. He turned to one of his guards. "Buy the boy's bond from his owner, then burn it." The guard moved. There was a brief, heated exchange between the guard and the textile merchant, Doric, who began to Praetor test, looked at the Alpha King, recalculated the math of his survival, and accepted the pouch of coins with shaking hands. The bronze collar was removed. The boy sat very still, touching his bare neck with fingers that trembled like leaves in a current. Elara looked at the king. The bond pulsed between them, undeniable, terrifying, alive. "I don't trust you," she said. "I haven't asked you to. This might be a mistake." "It might," he agreed. She found herself thrown by the honesty of it. Every authority figure she had ever known dealt in certainties, in commands, in the absolute language of power. This man, this king, this towering, scarred, amber-eyed force of nature, was allowing the possibility that he was wrong. It was the first crack in her armor. She would not know it until later. They left the tavern within the hour. Elara had nothing to pack. She owned the clothes she was wearing, a spare shift folded under her cot in the servants' quarters, and a piece of quartz she had picked up from a riverbed 8 years ago because it caught the light. She put the quartz in her pocket and walked out. The boy's name was Thomas. He sat in the supply wagon between bundles of provisions and stared at the road behind them with the shell-shocked expression of someone who had been unexpectedly pulled from deep water. Elara sat beside him. She did not touch him. She hummed. The king rode at the front of the column, mounted on a war horse that was nearly as massive as its rider. She watched him from the back of the wagon and tried to ignore the magnetic pull that wanted to close the distance between them. She was good at ignoring things. She had been practicing for 18 years. The journey to Ironmore took 3 days. Elara learned the rhythms of the king's company, the pre-dawn camp breaking, the midday rests where the horses were watered and the guards ate dried meat and hard bread. She was not required to work. She was not required to do anything. This was the most disorienting part. Her hands kept reaching for tasks that did not exist. She caught herself trying to clear the breakfast remnants, and one of the guards said gently, "That's not your job anymore." She did not know what her job was. She did not know what she was when she was not working. On the second night, the king came to the campfire where she sat. He moved quietly for a man his size, but she heard him anyway. Her senses had been changing since the tavern, sharpening, deepening, filling in details she had never been able to perceive before. She could smell the soap he used, plain tallow soap scented with juniper, and beneath it, his skin, which carried the permanent imprint of forge, smoke, and leather. He sat across the fire from her, not beside her. Across, giving her space. "The hymn," he said. "How many verses do you know?" "All of them. There are 9. He was quiet for a moment. "Will you teach me?" The question stunned her into stillness. He was not asking to possess the song. He was not demanding it as tribute or requiring it as entertainment. He was asking to learn it, the way a student asks a teacher, which inverted every power structure she understood. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. He looked into the fire. The flames turned his amber eyes to molten gold. "When I was 5, the Ashenmore emissary came to our court. His name was Roderick. He was a beta, older, with a voice like a drum. He sang the hymn at a feast, and I had never heard anything like it. My father dismissed it as backwater folk music. I memorized what I could." He paused. 2 months later, the Ashenmore fell. My father could have sent troops. He chose not to. He calculated that the cost of intervention outweighed the value of the alliance. He said this without excuse, without softening, just fact. "I became king 7 years ago," he continued. "The first thing I did was open the old alliance records. The Ashenmore entry was 3 lines long. Pack name, territory size, dissolution date. As if an entire people could be reduced to 3 lines. He looked at her. "Your hymn is the only proof that they were more than 3 lines. Elara felt the quartz in her pocket, smooth and warm from her body heat. She felt the fire on her face. She felt the ground beneath her, cold and damp, seeping through the borrowed blanket she sat on. "Third verse," she said. "Listen carefully." She taught him the 3rd verse. His voice was nothing like her father's, rougher, less musical, pitched lower. But he learned quickly, and he did not try to ornament or change the melody. He sang it straight, the way it was meant to be sung. They did not discuss the mate bond. They did not touch. But the filament of light between them grew warmer, and her wolf, for the first time in 18 years, stopped howling and lay down. Iron Moor was not what she expected. She had imagined a fortress, something dark and forbidding, all black stone and narrow windows, and the palpable atmosphere of a place built for war. And it was that, partly. The outer walls were massive, the color of charcoal, studded with iron bolts the size of her fist. The gates were reinforced with steel and guarded by wolves in human form, who carried weapons that gleamed with recent sharpening. But inside the walls, the city lived. Market stalls lined the main thoroughfare, selling everything from salted fish to bolts of indigo cloth. Children ran between the stalls. She heard laughter. She smelled bread baking, the warm, yeasty, golden scent of it cutting through the colder smells of stone and metal. And everywhere, flowers, window boxes, herb gardens, climbing roses on the inner wall, a riot of green and color that she had not expected from a place called Ironmore. The king dismounted and walked beside her wagon as it rolled through the gates. He did not explain the city. He did not narrate. He let her see it. She was given chambers, not a servant's room. Chambers. 2 rooms, with a window that looked onto an interior garden where someone had planted night-blooming jasmine, and the scent of it came through the glass in waves, sweet and heavy and almost painful. There was a bed with actual linens, a basin with warm water, a wardrobe containing clothes that were not worn through at the elbows. Thomas was given a room nearby. He came to her doorway that first evening and stood there, not entering, not leaving, until she said, "Come in, then." He came in and sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees pulled to his chest. "Is this real?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Are we going to have to pay for this?" She understood the question beneath the question. Nothing in their lives had ever been free. Every kindness had come with an invoice, payable in labor or obedience or silence. "I don't know," she said again. He was quiet. Then, very softly, he began to hum the hymn. She joined him. 2 voices, one small and one scarred, carrying a melody through the jasmine-scented air of a room neither of them had earned. The first week at Ironmore was a study in disorientation. Elara did not know how to be idle. She could not sit in her room without anxiety crawling up her spine like a physical thing, so she found the kitchen and made herself useful. The head cook, a formidable Omega woman named Sable, whose forearms were thick with flour dust and old burn scars, watched her for a morning without comment, then handed her a knife and a pile of root vegetables. "You can stay," Sable said, "but you work because you want to, not because anyone told you to. You understand the difference?" Elara was not sure she did. But the knife felt good in her hand, and the rhythm of chopping, the thud of blade against board, the clean, earthy smell of turnips and parsnips was familiar enough to quiet the static in her head. She learned things, working in the kitchen. She learned that Ironmore's pack was not the grim military machine she had imagined. It had families, traditions, jokes, feuds over garden plot boundaries, an annual baking competition that devolved into passionate arguments about crust technique. She learned that the king ate in the common hall 3 nights a week with his pack, sitting at the same table as everyone else, and that he had a weakness for honey cake that his guard captain, a woman named Vera, exploited shamelessly to win strategic arguments. She learned that Kyle Draven was respected, but not feared by his own people. This distinction took her several days to understand. The wolves of Ironmore did not cringe or flatten when he walked past. They nodded, some smiled. A few of the older women called him by his first name. A child of about 4 once ran directly into his legs at full speed, and he caught the boy, set him upright, said, "Good form, terrible aim," and continued walking. She watched all of this from the periphery, the kitchen, the garden, the edges of rooms. Her wolf watched, too, with increasing agitation, pressing against her awareness with a frequency and intensity that was new. The bond pulled. It pulled constantly. She could feel his location in the citadel, the way she could feel the direction of magnetic north, an internal compass that pointed unfailingly toward him. He did not push. He came to the garden some evenings, and they practiced the hymn. He was learning the 5th verse now, a section about wolves hunting under a winter moon, and his pronunciation of the old language was improving. They sat on a stone bench under the jasmine, and sometimes their knees almost touched, and the almost was a weight between them, a held breath that neither released. "You're different," she said one evening, "from what I expected." "What did you expect? A warlord. Someone who takes what he wants and destroys what he can't." "I have been that man," he said, "in war. War makes it necessary, or at least makes it feel necessary, which is almost the same thing." He turned a leaf between his fingers, a jasmine leaf, and the scent released from the crushed greenery was bitter and fresh. But a king who only knows how to take is a king who runs out of things eventually. That sounds like a line from a speech. He looked at her, and one corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, a recognition. "It is. I gave it at a council meeting last year. The council was not impressed." She almost laughed. She felt the shape of it in her chest, unfamiliar, like trying to use a muscle that had atrophied. It came out as a huff of air through her nose, barely audible. But he heard it. His eyes softened. This was the most dangerous thing about him. Not his power, not his send or his dominance, or the bond that linked them. His patience. He was dismantling her defenses not by force, but by simply being present, consistent, and honest. And she did not know how to defend against honesty, because no one had ever used it as a weapon before. On the 8th day, the danger arrived. Elara was in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough, when the scent hit her. Not a smell from the kitchen. Not juniper or iron or jasmine. Something older. Something that lived in the marrow of her nightmares. Sulphur and burned hair, and the particular mineral stench of a forge that had been used to make slave brands. She went rigid. The dough compressed under her whitening knuckles. "What is it?" Sable asked, reading her body language with the practiced eye of someone who recognized trauma responses. "Someone is here," Elara said. "Someone from before." The someone was a delegation from the Grey March territory. 3 wolves in traveling clothes, led by a man named Aldrich Voss, who was the current alpha of the Grey March pack, and the man who had overseen the textile mill where Elara had spent 4 years of her life. He was tall and lean, with pale eyes and a smile that never reached them, and he walked into Iron Moor's great hall like he owned it. Elara watched from the kitchen corridor, standing far enough back that the shadow covered her face. Her hands were still coated in flour, and she pressed them against her thighs to stop the shaking. Aldrich was there for diplomacy, border disputes, trade agreements, the ordinary machinery of interterritory politics. He greeted the king with the careful deference of a lesser alpha addressing a greater one, bowing just low enough, smiling just widely enough. He brought gifts, wine from Grey March's vineyards, a bolt of fine linen, and he brought a document. Elara could not hear the conversation from the corridor, but she saw the moment the document was presented, saw the king take it, saw his body language change, the subtle hardening, the stillness that she now recognized as the precursor to something violent being controlled. He sent Aldrich away to guest quarters. Then he came to the kitchen corridor. He knew she was there. Of course he did. The bond. He held up the document. "Do you know what this is?" She looked at it. Formal script. Heavy paper. The Grey March seal in wax. "No, it's a reclamation claim. Voss is asserting that your bond contract was improperly terminated, and that you are still, legally, the property of the Grey March Textile Collective." His voice was level. His eyes were not. "He wants you returned." The floor tilted. She put her hand against the stone wall to steady herself. The wall was cold. The cold traveled up her arm and settled in her chest. "Can he do that?" she asked. "The law is ambiguous. I burned your papers, but I am not the territorial authority over Grey March. Voss is arguing that the destruction of a bond contract without the issuing territory's consent is procedurally invalid. So he can take me back. He can try." The way he said it, the weight, the dark, absolute promise beneath the surface. His wolf was right there, pressing against his skin, turning his amber eyes fractionally brighter. "He will not succeed. You can't just—" She stopped, swallowed. "If the law is on his side, I will change the law." She stared at him. "You would change the law for 1 Omega? I would change the law because it is wrong. You are the reason I noticed it was wrong. There is a difference. This man, this impossible, patient, terrifying man." He kept giving her things she had never asked for. Freedom, safety. The melody of her own hymn sung back to her in a rough baritone, and the weight of the gifts was crushing, because she did not know what he wanted in return. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Her voice cracked on the question. He looked at her for a long time. Flour on her hands, the scar on her face catching the light from the kitchen doorway, her body still half turned toward escape. "I want you to stop running," he said. "Not from me, from yourself. You have been surviving for so long that you have forgotten that survival is not the same as living." He stepped closer, not touching her, close enough that the heat of him reached her skin through the layers of flour and fear. I want to hear you sing the 9th verse. And I want you to sing it because you choose to, not because a king asked you." He turned and walked away. She stood in the corridor with flour on her hands and his scent in her lungs, and felt her wolf rise up inside her. Not the small, muted, beaten thing she had carried for 18 years, but something larger, something that had been growing since the night in the tavern, something with teeth. Aldrich Voss stayed at Ironmore for 5 days. He was polite, he was diplomatic. He attended meals in the great hall and made conversation with the pack elders and complimented the food. He was, by every external measure, a reasonable man engaged in a legitimate legal dispute. But on the 3rd night, Elara found him in the kitchen corridor. She had come to fetch warm milk for Thomas, who was having nightmares again, his sleep fractured by the phantom weight of a collar that was no longer there. The corridor was dim, lit by a single oil lamp that threw long shadows. Aldrich was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, as if he had been waiting. "Hello, number 42, he said. "Her bond registry number." He did not use her name. He had never used her name. She stopped, every muscle in her body locked. Her wolf surged forward, larger than before, and for the first time in her life, she felt the shadow of something that might have been a growl building in her throat. "You've made quite the impression on the king," Aldrich continued. His voice was conversational, mild, the voice of a man discussing the weather. "An Omega. Fascinating. I knew you were different, of course. At the mill, the other workers avoided you, said you hummed in your sleep, and the sound made their wolves uneasy. I always wondered about that." "Get out of my way," Elara said. He did not move. "You know this won't end well. The king has his amusement. He'll tire of it. They always do. And when he does, the law will still be on my side, and you'll come back to Greymarch, and the next time I won't sell you to a tavern. I'll put you in the deep works, the salt mines, where nobody hums." She looked at him, at his pale eyes and his careful smile. And she saw something she had not expected, a flicker of something behind the cruelty. Not guilt, not hesitation. Something more complicated. He was afraid. Not of her, of the king. Of what the king represented, a shifting of power, a realignment that threatened the foundation on which Aldrich's authority stood. The reclamation claim was not about one Omega. It was about precedent. If the Alpha King could nullify a bond contract from another territory, then no Alpha's property was secure. Aldrich Voss was a man defending a system, not because he believed it was right, but because it was the only system in which he mattered. She saw this. She filed it away. And she stepped around him and walked down the corridor, and she did not look back. But when she returned to her room, after delivering the warm milk to Thomas and sitting with him until his breathing steadied, she locked her door. And she sat on her bed in the jasmine-scented dark and felt the panic she had been holding at bay wash over her in waves. She could not go back. She could not. The mill, the endless clatter of the looms, the dust that filled your lungs until you coughed blood, the overseer's belt buckle, the cold, the dark, the interminable grey of a life lived as a number. She would rather die. And the clarity of that thought shocked her, because she had spent 18 years choosing survival over everything else, and now, for the first time, there was something she was not willing to survive. She pressed her fists against her eyes. Her wolf howled, deep inside, a howl of rage and terror, and something else, something that sounded impossibly like a battle cry. She hummed the hymn, all 9 verses, start to finish. She hummed it into the darkness of her room, and the jasmine listened, and the night listened, and somewhere in the citadel, a king with amber eyes stopped pacing his study and stood still, hearing the faintest thread of melody through stone walls. And his wolf answered. The crisis came on the 5th day of Aldrich's visit. Elara was in the garden. Morning. Early enough that the dew was still on the jasmine, and the air was cool and tasted of green things and the faint mineral edge of the citadel's limestone walls. Thomas was with her, practicing letters on a slate that Sable had found for him. The boy was smart. He had never been taught to read, but he was absorbing the alphabet with the hungry focus of a mind that had been starved of input. Aldrich appeared at the garden's entrance. He was not alone. 2 of his wolves flanked him, big men with the blunt faces and thick hands of enforcers. Elara stood. Thomas pressed against her side. The slate clattered to the ground. "The council has ruled," Aldrich said. His voice was formal, stripped of the conversational veneer. "In absence of a countering claim of equal legal weight, the Greymarch reclamation stands. You are to return with me. Today." Elara's hands curled into fists. The king does not have jurisdiction over Greymarch territorial law. He was informed this morning. He disagreed. The council overruled him. Even kings have limits. Aldrich's mouth thinned. Not a smile, something colder. "Come quietly, 42. It will be easier." She did not come quietly. What happened next, she would struggle to remember clearly afterward. It came in pieces. Aldrich stepping forward, Thomas yelping as one of the enforcers reached for him. Elara's wolf, the one she had been told was weak, the one she had been told was barely there, the one she had spent 18 years believing was nothing more than a flicker. That wolf detonated. The sensation was nuclear. Heat, light. Power pouring through her veins like liquid metal, filling spaces she did not know she had. Spaces that had been empty her entire life. Her vision sharpened until she could count the individual hairs on Aldrich's head. Her hearing expanded until the drip of dew from a jasmine leaf sounded like a drum. Her body, thin and scarred and branded, felt suddenly and terrifyingly strong. She did not shift, not fully. But she felt her wolf rise to the surface, and what surfaced was not an Omega's wolf. Her eyes changed. She knew because she saw the reflection in Aldrich's widening gaze. Not the dull brown of an Omega. Gold. Deep, luminous, burning gold. The color of the eyes she had inherited from a mother she barely remembered. A mother whose name had been whispered in the Ashenmoor pack with reverence. A mother who had been not an Omega at all, but an Alpha. A true Alpha, hidden in an Omega's body to protect her from enemies who would have killed her for her bloodline. Elara was the daughter of the Alpha of Ashenmoor. The power that had been sleeping in her for 26 years woke up, and it was furious. Aldrich's wolves staggered. They could not help it. The dominance pouring off Elara was a physical force, a wall of pressure that hit them at chest height and pushed. One of them dropped to his knees. The other backed into the garden wall and stayed there, palms flat against the stone, eyes wide. Aldrich held. He was an Alpha himself, and his pride would not let him buckle. But she could see the strain, the tendons in his neck standing out, the sweat at his temples. His wolf, his ordered, territorial, systematized wolf, was screaming at him to submit. "You are not an Omega," he said. His voice was thick, strangled. "I never was." And even as she said it, she was not sure it was true in the way he meant it. She had been raised as an Omega. She had lived as an Omega. She had survived as an Omega. The power she carried did not erase that. It complicated it. She was both. The branded, scarred woman who had scrubbed tavern floors, and the Alpha's daughter, whose blood carried a dominance that had been compressed for decades and was now expanding like a spring released. Elara, the king's voice. Behind her. She felt him arrive before she heard him, the bond flaring like a struck match, and his presence was enormous, a second sun in the garden, his dominance rolling forward in waves that made the jasmine petals tremble on their stems. She turned. He was standing at the garden entrance. He had come at a run. She could see it in the rise of his chest, the slight disarray of his hair, and his eyes were fully gold, his wolf at full surface, and his expression was something she had never seen before. Not anger, awe. He was looking at her golden eyes and the power that radiated from her in visible waves, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has spent his entire life searching for something and has finally, against all reason, found it. Mate, he said. Not a claim, an acknowledgement. The word hung in the morning air like a note of music. Behind her, Aldrich made one last attempt. This changes nothing legally. The reclamation, silence. The king did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The word carried the full weight of his authority, and it hit Aldrich like a physical blow, snapping his jaw shut. The council's ruling is based on the assertion that this woman is a bondable Omega. She is clearly not. The law does not permit the bonding of alphas. Your claim is void on its face. The legal argument was sound, but everyone in the garden knew that the law was secondary. What was primary was the wall of combined dominance, Elara's and Kael's, pressing against Aldrich's wolves like a tide against sand. Aldrich Voss was many things, cruel, calculating, systematic. But he was not stupid. He looked at Elara, her eyes blazing gold, and then at the king, whose eyes burned like twin forge fires, and he did the math. I withdraw the claim, he said. He turned to leave, and then he stopped. Elara watched him hesitate, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, something in it that she had never heard from him before, and would never hear again. I knew, he said, at the mill. I knew you were more than an Omega. Your wolf frightened the machinery. Did you know that? The looms would stutter when you hummed. I could have reported it. I chose not to. I told myself it was because a hidden alpha in my workforce was too valuable to surrender. But I think... He stopped. The pause lasted 3 heartbeats. I think part of me just wanted to hear the song. He left. His wolves followed. Elara watched him go, and felt something twist in her chest that was not forgiveness, but might have been its distant, grudging cousin. Understanding. The recognition that cruelty and loneliness could live in the same body. And that a man could be your tormentor, and still, in some stunted, airless corner of himself, be human. The garden was quiet. The jasmine dripped. Tomas, pressed against the wall, was shaking. Elara went to him first. She knelt, took his hands, said, "It's over. You're safe." He looked at her golden eyes and said, "Your eyes are different." She said, "I know." He said, "They're beautiful." She said, "Thank you." Then she stood and faced the king. He was still at the entrance. He had not moved. The patience again. The devastating, terrifying patience. "You knew," she said, "that I was more than an Omega." "I suspected. Your wolf's resonance was too complex for an Omega bond. But I did not know for certain until now. He paused. It changes nothing about what I want. And what you want, I have told you. I want to hear the 9th verse. I want you to sing it freely. Everything else is secondary. Even the mate bond? The bond is not a cage, Elara. It is a door. You can walk through it, or you can leave it closed. But I will not open it for you. She stood in the garden with dew on her shoes, and power crackling under her skin, and the scent of jasmine and iron and pine filling her lungs. And she made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a cinematic, sweeping, fall into his arms decision. A quiet one. An internal shifting of weight, like leaning forward on a precipice and choosing not to pull back. 9th verse, she said. Tonight, in the great hall. I will sing it for the pack. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Something larger and more careful than a smile. A realignment. A settling. As if a structural weight had been lifted from a foundation, and the entire building was adjusting to a new, truer position. As you wish, he said. The great hall at Ironmoor was built of dark stone and heavy timber, with a vaulted ceiling that caught sound and held it the way a cathedral holds prayer. The tables were pushed back. The fire pits burned with clean, dry oak that smelled of warmth and age. The pack gathered, hundreds of wolves, alphas and betas and omegas, families with children balanced on hips, elderly pairs who leaned into each other, young wolves with restless energy and curious eyes. Elara stood at the center of the hall. The floor was flagstone, worn smooth by generations of feet. She could feel the cold of it through her shoes, but it was not the cold of the tavern floor, not the cold of indifference and grime. This cold was old and solid, foundation cold, the kind of cold that comes from deep stone that has stood for centuries. Thomas sat in the front row. He had been given new clothes, a warm shirt that was slightly too large, and he held the edges of the sleeves between his fingers, rubbing the soft fabric. Sable sat beside him, her flowery hand on his shoulder. The king stood to the side, not at the center, not on a throne, at the side, making room. Elara opened her mouth and sang the Ashenmoor battle hymn from the beginning, all 9 verses. The first verse was fire and courage, and the sound of wolves running under a war sky. Her father's verse. She sang it with a voice she did not know she had, a voice that had been building for 10 years in taverns and mills and the quiet corridors of servitude, a voice strengthened by the thousands of times she had hummed this melody for strangers who did not know what they were hearing. The second verse was the return, the path through the forest. She sang it and saw Maren's face, the old herbalist's creased smile, her lavender-scented hands, and she sang it for Maren who had died in a labor camp with this melody on her lips. The third verse, the king knew. She heard his voice join hers, rough and low, and the harmony was imperfect, and it was perfect. 2 voices finding each other across a divide of years and pain and power. The 4th verse was the hunt. The 5th, the winter moon. The 6th, the gathering of the pack before battle. The 7th, the naming of the dead. And here her voice broke, and she let it break, let the crack carry meaning that words could not. The 8th verse was the hardest. It was a lament for home, for the smell of hearth smoke, and the sound of children playing, and the particular quality of light that falls through pine trees in late afternoon. A light that exists in one place and no other. And when that place is gone, the light goes with it. She sang it, and tasted salt on her lips, and did not wipe the tears away. The 9th verse, she had never sung it aloud. Not once. Not in 18 years of humming. The 9th verse was the one her mother had taught her last, on the night before the burning, as if she had known what was coming, as if she had encoded her final message in a melody. The 9th verse was not about battle or return or death. It was about the wolf that remains when everything else is lost. The wolf that carries the song forward. The wolf that refuses to be the last. It was about singing into the darkness, not because the darkness would answer, but because the singing itself was the point. The act of remembering was the act of survival. The hymn was the pack. As long as someone carried it, the pack endured. Elara sang it, and the great hall of Ironmore held the sound, and the sound filled the stone and the timber and the air, and the wolves of Ironmore listened, and something in the room shifted. Not dominance, not power, something older and more fundamental. Recognition. The acknowledgement that every wolf, every pack, every territory existed on the edge of the same abyss, the abyss of forgetting, and that the only thing that stood between them and that edge was the willingness to carry each other's songs. When the last note faded, the silence was absolute, not the silence of a tavern confronted by an alpha king, not the silence of fear, the silence of people who have been given something sacred and are still holding it. Then Sable, from the front row, began to hum. She picked up the melody of the 9th verse, her voice a low, flower-rough alto, and she carried it. Next to her, Thomas joined, his thin voice threading through hers. And then another voice, and another. Wolves who had never heard the Ashenmoor hymn, picking up the melody by ear, learning it in real time, passing it from throat to throat like a font spreading through kindling. The king did not sing. He stood at the side of the hall and watched Elara, and his expression was open in a way she had never seen it, the walls down, the controlled demolition complete. And what was underneath was not weakness. It was the thing that had been holding the walls up all along. Love. Not the performative, declarative kind. The kind that sits in a man's chest like a stone and does not move, does not waver, does not demand acknowledgement, just endures. After the hall emptied, after the fires burned down to coals, after Tomas fell asleep in his chair, and Sable carried him to bed, Elara and Kyle stood alone in the great hall. The coals threw soft red light across the flagstones. The smell of oak smoke and the ghost of the hymn lingered in the high ceiling. In the old tradition, Elara said, the alpha and the mate sing the hymn together on the night of the claiming, all 9 verses. I only know 3. Then I will teach you the rest. It will take time. Yes, he looked at her. She looked at him. The bond between them was not a filament anymore. It was a rope, a bridge, a thing she had built, beam by beam, verse by verse, across the abyss of 18 years. She stepped toward him, 1 step, 2. Close enough to feel the heat of him, close enough to smell juniper soap and forge smoke and the electric pre-storm charge that was just him, just his skin, the alchemy of his body. She raised her hand. She placed it flat against his chest, over his heart. His heartbeat was steady and strong, a drum she could have set a march to. Mate, she said, not a question, not a concession, a decision. His hand came up and covered hers. His fingers were warm. His palm was calloused from swords and reins and the endless work of holding a kingdom together. He did not pull her closer. He held her hand against his heart and let her feel his pulse, and the pulse said what his patience had been saying for weeks. I am here. I am not leaving. The door is open. She leaned forward, and pressed her lips to the scar on his jaw, the old one, the childhood wound. He went still. Then his other hand came up, slowly, and touched the scar on her face, the one the overseer's belt buckle had carved. His thumb traced the line from her temple to her jaw, not with pity, but with attention, learning the topography of her survival. "When you are ready," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and only when you are ready." "I have been humming a song into the dark for 10 years, waiting for someone to hear it," she said. "I am tired of waiting." She tilted her head, exposed her throat. Not in submission, in trust. The difference was everything. He leaned down. His lips touched the juncture of her neck and shoulder, where the marking bite would go. She felt the pressure of his teeth, the warm exhalation of his breath against her skin. Her wolf rose, not the frightened, muted thing of the tavern, not even the blazing, golden-eyed force of the garden. Something between. Something that was both Omega and Alpha, both scarred and whole. A wolf that carried the hymn in its very marrow. He bit. The pain was brief and precise, a sharp, clean thing, nothing like the pain she had known, nothing like belts or brands or the slow, grinding attrition of servitude. This pain was a door opening. The bond flooded through her, a cascade of warmth and light and connection, his heartbeat synchronizing with hers, his breath matching hers. His wolf and her wolf meeting in the space between their bodies and recognizing each other with a joy that was not sentimental or soft, but fierce, ancient, primal. She gasped. He caught her, his arms around her, and she was not small in them, not diminished, not contained. She was held. The mark on her neck burned and then cooled, settling into her skin like a signature. His mark. Her choice. "9th verse," she whispered against his chest. "Sing it with me." He did. His voice rough, hers steady. Two wolves carrying a hymn through the last of the firelight, in a hall of dark stone and heavy timber, while the coals burned down and the night settled over Ironmore like a blanket drawn over a sleeping child. The claiming ceremony was held 3 days later in the great hall in front of the entire pack. The traditions of Ironmore required it. Public acknowledgement, witnesses, the formal binding of the Alpha King to his mate, and the elevation of that mate to Luna, to Queen, to the second seat of power. Elara wore no white. She wore a shirt the color of ashes, because Sable had asked her what color she wanted, and she had said, "The color of what's left after the burning." And Sable had understood without explanation. The shirt was soft, well made. It covered the brand on her shoulder blade. She had chosen not to have the brand removed. She would carry it the way she carried the hymn. Not because it defined her, but because it was part of the story. Thomas stood beside her. He was scrubbed clean and wearing the too large shirt and holding a candle with both hands. And his face was the face of a child who is beginning, slowly, like a plant uncurling toward light, to believe that the world might not always be a fist. The king stood across from her. No crown. He still did not wear one. He wore black, the color of Ironmore's walls, and the scar on his jaw caught the candlelight, and his eyes were amber, steady, unwavering. The ceremony was simple. Words spoken. Hands clasped. The marking bite witnessed by the pack, who howled in unison, a sound that shook the rafters and sent the candle flames guttering. But the part that Elara would remember, the part that would stay with her long after the ceremony and the feast and the years that followed, was not the bite or the howl or the vows. It was the moment before. The moment when the hall was full and the pack was waiting, and Kael looked at her across the flagstone floor, with the coals glowing and the jasmine from the garden somehow reaching in through the windows, and he sang the 9th verse. Alone. His rough voice filling the hall. Not because anyone asked him to, not because tradition demanded it, because he had learned the song, and it was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the pack now, to Thomas, to Sable, to the dead of Ashen Moor and the living of Iron Moor. To every stranger she had hummed it to in 10 years of taverns and mills and cold corridors. He sang, and she listened, and the song was the same, and the song was different. And this was how a hymn survived, not by being preserved in amber, by being passed from voice to voice, each singer changing it slightly, each throat adding its own particular texture of grief and hope and imperfection, until the song was not a relic, but a living thing, growing, adapting, refusing to die. Aldrich Voss did not return to Iron Moor. He sent a formal letter withdrawing the reclamation claim and acknowledging the Alpha King's mate bond. The letter was dry and procedural, and contained in the margins a handwritten note in small, cramped script. It read, "The looms have been quiet since she left." Whether this was complaint or confession, Elara could not tell. She kept the letter in a drawer and did not read the note again. Thomas learned to read in 3 months. He had a gift for it. The words poured into him the way water pours into dry ground, filling cracks he did not know he had. He read everything: histories, almanacs, bestiaries, the Iron Moor trade records, a stack of adventure novels that Vera the guard captain smuggled to him from a market stall. He read aloud to Elara in the evenings, his voice growing steadier, losing the thin, cautious quality of a child expecting to be interrupted. On a night in late autumn, the garden's jasmine dying back for winter, the air carrying the first bite of frost, Elara sat on the stone bench where she and Kael had practiced the hymn. Thomas was inside, reading. The king was in council. The garden was quiet. She hummed, not from habit this time, not from compulsion or survival or the desperate need to keep something alive. She hummed because the song was beautiful, and the night was cold, and the jasmine smelled of endings that were also beginnings. And somewhere in the citadel, the man she had chosen was listening. She stopped humming and sat in the silence that followed. The silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that exists after music, shaped by what came before, holding the ghost of the melody in its architecture. She reached into her pocket. The quartz was still there, the piece she had picked up from a riverbed 8 years ago. She turned it in her fingers. It caught the moonlight and held it, a small, cold sun in the palm of her hand. She set the quartz on the bench beside her, left it there, stood, walked inside. Behind her, the moonlight found the stone and made it glow, a point of light in an empty garden, marking the place where a woman who had once been property sat and sang and chose, finally, to stop carrying everything alone.